All right, hello. In this video, we're going to talk about how to do authentication using Firebase. Authentication is the ability for us to sign in different users, right? To log in with different user accounts. Authentication means that you are authenticating that that person is who they actually say they are, right? We're saying that, yes, you are, in fact, the person you think. That's what sort of usernames and passwords are designed to do. So we're going to go through in this how to get set up and how to enable that kind of authentication and use that sign-in service through Firebase to support our web application. So similar to the database, the first thing you want to do is we need to get it set up and configured inside of the Firebase sort of project, not inside of our code necessarily, but inside of the project. So we're going to do that, but similar to how we did with the database. We're going to start at the on the Firebase console. We're going to start by looking at the project overview, sort of where the project is. If we go under build to all the different things that our application is Firebase is able to provide to us, we're now going to be interested in turning on authentication. So we're going to go to the authentication tab. And when we do that, it opens us up to, again, a thing that tells us about what application authentication looks like, and we can click our big Get Started button to now get started with enabling authentication. So the first thing it's going to ask us to specify as we begin figuring out setting up authentication is who we want to be the authentication providers. So the providers are the services, the sort of the extra systems that do that validation, do that thing that says, yes, you are who you say you are. So Firebase provides a couple of built-in providers we can use. It lets us be able to say Firebase can do sort of an email password verification. Make sure you have that. And we can turn that on by clicking on it and hitting enable. Right, we're going to say that's an option we want to do. We're going to turn it on. We say we want to enable. We want to allow this kind of sign-in, this kind of version of authenticating who our user is. And then we can hit save. From that, we can also add additional providers as well. So this is in our sign-in method tab, like different providers we support. We can add additional providers along the way. And this includes being able to provide have other services do that authentication work, right? We can have students, have users sign in with their Google account and say, hey, Google, can you verify this person who actually are? They can sign in with Facebook, with GitHub, with Twitter, with any of these kinds of services. And you can also add in our additional providers if we know any. Just to demonstrate sort of how this looks and how this comes together, we're also going to turn on our Google providing. So again, we click to say we want to add that as Google, and we will then click that we want to enable it. So it's going to sort of ask for a public name of it. You can just leave that as the default. You will need to provide an email address because this way, if something goes wrong with you're using Google, then they need to know who to contact. Not that they ever will, but they need to know that. So you can just put in your email address. It's fine. And then we'll hit save in order to enable that kind of provider. And Google takes a second. Great. Again, you can always go back to the console in order to see our sign-in methods and what providers we've had. You can always enable them, disable them, configure them, and do a bunch of other work as well. Otherwise, the main place that we're going to sit in our authentication is in our users list. So this is going to be the list of every user who has ever authenticated against our application, who we've sort of registered as that's a person who has used our program. So this is similar to kind of like the database was the view of the data. This is our view of our user data. This sometimes erroneously gets referred to as a user database, which is accurate. It is a database of users, but it's not the database. It's not the database the same way the real-time database is a database. It doesn't let us store data. We can't access it like a data. I really like thinking of it as the user list that just happens to be listing out the details from the users. All this stuff is then stored in Firebase. All right. The one other note I need to make about setting up Firebase authentication is as of September 2023, which was fairly recent for the recording of this video, Google added some extra security features to basically avoid letting that sort of information get leaked when other people start trying to sign in through Google or sign in through other processes. This is great. This is a good security practice. Thanks, Google. However, when we are testing and developing new applications in Firebase, and we want to do a lot of like sign in, sign out, because we want to keep testing how user authentication works, it can potentially cause some issues because it looks like we're trying to, hack our way into the system by constantly putting in new passwords and new options. So the workaround for this, the easiest thing that I've found is that when you're doing development, Right? So when you haven't deployed your application, when you're not sort of in production mode, when you're just in development, is to turn off this feature, right? Turn off this additional security feature, similar to how with the database, we sort of turned off our security rules to be able to, again, let us do testing work. So again, there's instructions on how we can do that linked from the documentation. But in general, we're going to go to our settings under auth. We are going to, I have to keep looking this up to remember these. We are going to go to user actions. And then we're going to remove email enumeration protection. While that's recommended, we're going to turn it off for now. And that way we won't have these potential issues that are going to show up as we start doing a bunch of testing and development of our application. Make sure you go turn that back on once you're done. That's, again, similar to with your security rules for your database, the way you went and go like re-enable those, go turn that stuff back on once you're sort of ready to have like a final project. But when you're sort of testing your authentication work, you can go ahead and turn it off. Okay. So this is going to be where our user lists are going to show up. We can add users manually to this, but we're generally not going to do that. We're going to sort of have them sign up through our application to see how that works. The important part here is that the stuff that's stored in this user list is going to be the user sort of account, their name, their their identifier, their password, like an email if they have one, and like a picture is like a URL for a photo is about the minimum we able to store here. We can't store generic data in our user list, right? We're not creating a users table that can have other attributes. We can't add their shoe size or their favorite color or any of the other details. The only things that get stored here is basically think just username, password, because it's stored in this user list in a very secure fashion, right? Firebase keeps that locked down. We can't go look at people's passwords. They can't go access their passwords, right? They can do some reset stuff we can do as well. But that's where that gets all set together. So think about this again. This is a list of users. It's not a user database. Any user data, like favorite color, favorite food, posts they make, anything like that, will need to go inside the real-time database. Okay, and that's how we sort of get Firebase set up on the console. The next thing we're going to talk about then is how we actually do sign-in. And we're going to do that using a system called Firebase UI. So we could go ahead and create our own sign-in form, right? We know how to do that using HTML. We can write a form with inputs. We can style it to make it look nice. There's a lot of sign-in forms. They all look kind of the same. And getting those to connect to Firebase is a little bit of it's a lot of boilerplate code. It tends to be tedious and kind of redundant and pain in the butt. Particularly if you want to then be able to support signing in with different providers. Right? If I want to be able to log in with Google, there's other work I have to do for that. So what we're going to do instead is use a tool a library called Firebase UI, which stands for Firebase User Interfaces. That's basically going to provide us a sign-in component, a sign-in form that'll work really well and look really nice and will let us enable to actually sign in to Firebase. So this is a library we can use, right? That's built and created by Firebase, right? We can go to its Google page. Right, it is created by Firebase. It's actually part of the Firebase system in order to be able to make all those things come together. So again, what we'll do is we'll just import this library, we'll install it, we'll be ready to go, and that'll like make everything, let us be able to quickly and easily add a login form to our page. Now, the trick here is that Firebase UI has a set of bindings for React, right? It has a version of this library that works with React and doesn't work with just pure DOM. Because remember, pure DOM and React won't play well together. So it does have a way that we can get it working with React. There's a library called Firebase UI Web React, which is sort of the React version of this. However, this library has never been updated to work with the current version of React, which is React 18. It still only works with React version like 16. And it appears to basically have been abandoned, right? If we go look at the actual GitHub page for this library, it hasn't been developed in 3 years, right? Nothing has ever changed. There's been a pull request, a bunch of an issue saying that this doesn't work with React. Please update it. It's a simple set of fixes to make in the code to actually fix that change. Gabriel Villeneuve, which is I think he was a developer at Microsoft at the time, like wrote the code to fix it because it's open source. It says, here's how you do it. Just please accept this request, integrate it into your system, and we'll be good to go. And that never happened. Google appears to have abandoned it. We can hypothesize that Google is maybe saying this is React is a system that's created by Meta, Google and Meta are, sort of competitors in a lot of spaces. Maybe they don't want to be supporting Meta in different ways. I don't know if that's what's actually going on, or it's just that it's off their radar, so they never updated it. So basically it means that we can't just use Firebase UI for React. It doesn't work anymore. So there's two workarounds that we have options for us. One is, instead of installing the sort of official Firebase UI Web React library package, we can instead install the fork, the version that was made for the pull request. Sort of, here's the fixed version, and we can install that instead. That tends to be the easiest approach to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to run our npm install just like we would normally, but instead of installing it by name, Firebase UI Web React, we're going to install it by URL. I'm going to say literally go to this GitHub repository and install this fork, this file of the application. So I'm going to copy that code. We will go into our terminal. We are inside of our Firebase project. This is our Firebase version 2 because we're doing authentication now. And I'm going to go ahead and run that installation command. And that will go ahead and install that library. The other option is you can install the base Firebase UI, not the React version, but sort of just the Firebase version, and then copy and paste in the sort of React component that integrates that all together cleanly. That also works okay. I kind of like just installing the library because then I don't have to think about it. Then I don't have an extra file sitting around in my code. But that's a thing you can sort of, again, decide how you want to do it. I think this is a really good example of how, while we're building things with React, there are these library-centric approaches where a lot of people have done work for us that we can use. Keeping that stuff maintained, it requires the sort of full open source community, and sometimes gets you to having to deal with different kinds of workarounds. So you do have to keep an eye on what is the way, which libraries are you using? Have they been updated recently? Will they work with the current version of React? That's sort of thing you have to consider when you're working with external libraries in sort of client-side applications. Okay, that goes ahead and gets installed and it's set up. If we then look in our package.json file, you can see that we have Firebase, React Firebase UI, which is the name of the package library that we'll install. That's what we'll import. And instead of giving us just a normal version number, which says go to npm and find this version number, it actually says you can find this file at this URL. So this is, again, a way that we can integrate different libraries, not just coming from sort of the npm register, but from lots and lots of different locations around the web if we want to. Be cautious about this, right? This is sort of less controlled than something like npm's registry. Like, there's less audit, not there's a lot of auditing on npm registry, but it's less controlled. That said, this is a trusted package. We know where it came from. We know what it does because we can go look at it. Okay, with that is installed and we're ready to go. So now we can go ahead and actually add in our application. So let's go over to our code. So the idea, well, actually, hold on. Let's pull open the documentation for the sort of the web code that we're working with. And basically what we're going to end up doing is using a component that is provided by this library, which is a styled Firebase auth. So that is going to be a login form, a styled login form to Firebase. So in our code, right, we have our sign-in page, which I actually can't show you because we're not able to do it yet. Oh wait, yes we can. Let me not navigate site user directly. So there's our page that currently says there's our sign-in page. Right, here's our sign-in page, the one we're used to seeing. This is our standard drop-down box, our user list that we've had in the past. What we're effectively going to do is we're going to replace this drop-down box, right? This component, and again, in our sign-in page, this is our drop-down. We're going to replace that drop-down with this styled Firebase UI component. So instead of making our own drop-down list of users, we're going to set up a set of buttons that Firebase provides for us. So that's how we can do that. As with any other library, if we want to use another component, we are going to import that component and then render that component. So we are going to import, double check our syntax. We are going to import styled Firebase auth from React Firebase styled Firebase auth. So we're doing a default import similar to what we did with React Bootstrap. So again, this will be import styled Firebase auth from React Firebase UI / styled Firebase auth. And that's the component that we want to use. Now that the component is used, we can go ahead and render it. So instead of showing our normal drop-down menu, we'll just remove, I'm going to comment that out. We're just going to remove that. Instead, we're going to show a styled Firebase auth. So again, we're just replacing one component, one set of DOM, with another component. All right. Styled Firebase auth takes two props that we need to worry about. The first prop it takes, we can see this in our documentation. The first prop it takes that we're going to talk about is called a Firebase auth prop. Firebase auth. The Firebase auth is the authenticator. It's basically a reference to which Firebase project and which authentication, which user list should we be comparing it against. This is very similar to the database, right? Remember when we were accessing the real-time database, we had to get access to the database in order to create references to it. In this case, we need to get access to the user list, the authenticator, in order to do any kind of sign-in, sign-out authentication work. So we can get access to the authenticator we can create ourselves a variable for it. So this is the authenticator, which often is just referred to as the auth. And we can access that by calling get authenticator, get auth, calling the get auth function. This function comes from Firebase, so we're going to need to import it as well. We can import the get auth function from Firebase/auth. Again, this is very similar in concept to in our chat pane when we had imported the get database function from the Firebase database. Now we're importing get auth from the Firebase authentication library. So we're not working the database, we're working the authenticator. Get auth will let me get access to the authenticator. Type out full. And then we can pass in the authenticator as a prop to our styled Firebase auth. Cool. The second prop that our styled Firebase auth is going to support is called a UI config. So UI config is going to get assigned a config object, which is just going to be a normal JSON object that contains a bunch of configuration information, like what kinds of providers do we want to support? What kinds of buttons should we include? What do you want to look like? All that sort of details about how it should work get specified as variables, as values inside of an object that gets passed this configuration details. This is a standard configuration pattern where we're going to sort of define a bunch of here's the structure, here's all the properties it should have, and then we pass those properties to this other thing that then is able to interpret them and use them and set them up correctly. All right, so the details on how to set up a Firebase UI auth config object are complicated and spread across a bunch of different documentation because there's ones that are sort of related to Firebase React, there's ones related to Firebase UI, and all over the place. In the textbook, I do have an example of a Firebase UI config object. And I'm going to sort of start with this one because this is sort of defines what is sort of the bare minimum and the best practice for getting us to be able to have a good sign-in form, one that you can use. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy and paste this out of the textbook, and we'll sort of talk about then what it looks like. So I'm going to define this as I'm going to go ahead, I'll put it as a global variable. It doesn't matter too much. It's not actually, no, let's keep it inside the sign-in page just in case we ever wanted to work with it. All right, so we're going to basically define ourselves a variable that can live inside of our sign-in page, because that's what's showing our application. So here's our Firebase UI config object. So it has a number of properties, right? I have a sign-in options property, sign-in flow, credential helper callback, etc. The sign-in options property is an array of providers that we want to use. And we list those providers not as strings, right? Not as the name, but by using them through a number, a provider ID. So like Google's ID might be 1 or 6, an email provider might be 12, and there's some random numbers that are produced. We can get access to those IDs by getting them from the auth provider object that's available from Firebase auth. So we can go ahead and import the email auth provider because that's what we want to be able to support email password. We can import the Google auth provider because we want to support Google. And then we can basically just create a list of these things. So we could, for example, just say, I'm going to sort of clean up a little bit. We could just say, I want to have my providers be, right, and like what sign options I support. Here's an array of providers. Email auth, Google auth, right? Those are the two things we support. If we want to add more, we just start adding more to that list. Instead of putting in the provider ID itself, we can alternatively pass in an entire object. Oop, copy it back from here because I deleted it. We can pass in we can specify an entire object that has a key provider where the provider ID happens, as well as other configurations. So for example, we can say I want to sign in with email auth provider, but also make sure they ask the user for a display name for us to be able to work with. So we're going to provide those pieces as well. Okay. The second options are mostly here just to make sure that everything works smoothly. Sign-in flow, we want to use pop-up. We don't want to redirect to another web page, to bring them to the Google sign-in form, because we want to instead pop up a new window. If it redirects them to another form, then we've left our page, which means all our state disappears, and we lose track of all that stuff, and that's going to cause issues for React. So we're going to want to pop up a new window, redirect them somewhere else. I have a note here for don't show what's called the credential helper, which is sort of a thing that Chrome provides that says that once you've signed in with email, if you go back to the page and try to sign in again, it like prompts you with, did you mean this email? So one you used last time, which I'm going to turn off because I want to be able to demonstrate lots of emails. And then finally, we need to indicate what happens when someone finishes signing in. And so what we're doing is we're going to specify a set of callbacks of sort of life cycle events, like things that happen in the process and what we want to do with those stages. It's a little bit like how hooks work in React, a little bit, but they're not hooks. So in particular, we want to say that when the user signs in successfully, don't do anything special, right? We're like, great, the user signed in, that's fine. We'll handle it separately. Don't do anything in particular. But this is where you could be able to do things like when the user signs in, you could modify some state variables, you could set some properties, you could redirect them to a certain page. This is how you can make sure that, for example, if the user signs in, do I want to then ask them for further information, right? Is there an initial like data form you want them to fill out? You can sort of manage some of that through this process right here. Okay, so this creates our configuration object, which we've called Firebase UI config. We will then pass that in as the UI config object to our Firebase auth. And with that, assuming I haven't screwed anything up, we should be able to have our auth form up here. There we go. And we refresh our page. And now, instead of showing our normal dropdown, we see a beautiful Firebase auth sign-in form. Hey. We have two options. If I click sign in with Google, it will pop open the sort of Google sign-in form, which we can be able to use. This works as actually normal. I'm not going to play that right now. If we click to sign in with email, it'll prompt us for an email address. For test, you can see my examples I've done in the past right here. For testing, make up an email address. Don't try to come up with a real email address. Don't put in your real Google address. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a lot of typing. And if you want to use multiple users, you want to test with different people, you have to make up multiple email addresses. So I like picking really generic email addresses like a@a.com, right? a@example.com, a or whatever. That works great. Cool. I hit next. Because it's a new email address, like notice the form it modifies it. It's interactive without me doing any extra work. That's just built into the styled Firebase auth. But it'll then prompt me for a sort of display name, first and last name. I'm gonna put person A because this is my first person. It then asks for a password. You can put in any password you want. It has to be at least 6 characters long for it to be a Firebase password. I recommend not coming up with any, again, when you're testing, when you're making up fake people, don't come up with anything complex. Come up with something really simple that's easy to type and easy to remember, because if you forget your login for your testing user, that's a pain in the butt. So I like using a very common password. It is 8 letters. It starts with pass and it ends with word, which is fine. It's not secure, but it'll let me always remember how I can get into my system. Cool. And with that, we can hit save. Google's going to prompt me for this forever. It's going to drive my demo crazy, so I apologize. Just ignore it. At which point, our form goes away because now I am signed in. Now, our app doesn't acknowledge the fact that I'm signed in. We haven't built the rest of the app to actually like know that the user signed in. But from Firebase's perspective, I just said, hey, Firebase, am I the right person? Am I a person that you know? And Firebase says, yep, you're signed up. You're all good to go. And we can tell that by going to our authentication form, right? Go into our user list. If I hit reload here and refresh, we can now see there's my new person, right? Person A.com. They're an email provider. That's how we know. We see when they were created. And we have a user ID. We have a sort of a unique hash code that represents what that user is and who that person is. Firebase does provide a number of sort of like account administration options, right? You can do sort of like email reset. You can send them an email to reset their password. You can disable them or delete them. You can adjust that stuff. It is possible to also build in web code to be able to like send those emails directly, right? So you can be, so the user can be like, I forgot my password, please reset it. We're not going to go through all those processes right now, but they do exist. Cool. So that goes ahead and creates my person. If I go back to my page and I refresh it, Firebase, again, my app doesn't know that I ever signed in, so it all forgets it. I can sign with email again. I can make a new person. B.com. B. Logs me in, refresh, ta-da, now I have two different users, each with a different user ID. The cool thing in our sign-in form, right, if I go to sign in and I say I want to sign in as A@A.com, that person's already in my list, so it doesn't prompt them for their display name anymore. Now it actually says, who are you, put in your password. If I put in a bad password, right, if I just put in bad, and I try to sign in, it'll tell me that that's incorrect, right? We get form validations, all that stuff happens the way we want. If I put in the correct password, it signs me in, and voila, I am now signed in as that user. And that's how we sort of get users signing in, right? That's how we get put into the Firebase Authenticator. The next thing that we need to manage, once we're able to get the user signed into Firebase, is actually managing their authentication. Right? We want to make sure that we're keeping track that our application knows whether a user is signed in or not signed in. What we need to be able to do is I want my app, right? My app has a current user that keeps track of who is currently logged in. We want that current user to actually match whether or not the user, like when the user signs in. So when the user signs into Firebase, we want our current user to also get updated. So the way that we're going to do that, for a second, is we're going to do something similar to with our database. Right? Remember how with our database, we were listening for database changes, and from that, we then modified our state. We're going to do a very similar concept, very similar idea for the authentication. What we're going to do is we're going to use a listener, and we're going to listen for when the user signs in or signs out. And when the user signs out, then we can signs in, then we can update our current user to now be a new person, because now a new user has signed in. So in order to do that, we're going to use another method that we're going to get from Firebase. The method we are going to use is called on-auth state change. And we're going to get it from Firebase auth. Let me double check the notes. It is on-auth state. Yep, on-auth state changed. Excuse me, changed. There we go. So it's similar to on value, right? When a value changes, this is when your authentication state changes. Firebase has really, really good variable names that tell you exactly what they're talking about. So on-auth state change says that when the state of the user's authentication changes, right? When your status logged in, logged out, whenever that changes, this event will go off and we can then react to it. All right, so we got a listener. Similar to with our database, right? We're going to setting up a listener, right? Hooking up that thing to listen for Firebase and for when something happens on the database, or sort of on the server side, is a side effect. It's different from props come in, DOM goes out. So we're going to set up this listener inside our effect hook. And I'm just going to use the same one that I used for initially logging in a user. We're going to use this to log in our to authenticate our user. So we're going to call our function on-auth state changed. On-auth state change is going to take in 2 arguments, really similar to how on value took in 2 arguments. we're not going to use a reference to a spot in the database. What we're going to do is we're going to need to know what authenticator, right? What user list do we want to be listing for? Do we want to be comparing things against? So we're going to need to get access to that authenticator again, which means I'm going to need to import get auth. And now that I've imported get auth, I can then, of course, create my authenticator. And again, don't worry about trying to make a global auth variable. Just like go ahead and it's a getter. It's instantaneous. It's just accessing a setter, a singleton. So just go ahead and call it whenever you need it, and you're good. Great. So I'm going to pass in the auth, and then I'm going to pass in a callback function, which is what function is going to get executed. Right, a function that's going to be what function gets executed when the user logs in. This is a function. I'm going to write it as an arrow function because that's how we write callbacks these days. Cool. The argument that'll be passed into this callback function is going to be a Firebase user object. That's what gets passed. That's what the event handler is going to pass into that function. So we can do some work. I can then log out, for example, that my auth state has changed. And for fun, we can log out then what our Firebase user object looks like. All right, here we go. Go back to our demo. Code page. I'm going to refresh my page. Notice that when we first load the page, even though I haven't done any signing in yet, it tells me that my auth state has changed. That's because, again, similar to with the database, when the application first connects to Firebase, it says, hey, Firebase, I have a user list. That means suddenly I know whether someone's signed in or out or not, in which case it tells me someone is signed in. And the person it says that signed in, right, here's my user object. If I expand this out, you'll see that the person it says that's signed in is person A, the last person I signed in as. That's because Firebase is authenticator, right? This structure and how Firebase works is actually will cache, it'll store the fact that the user signed in. It gets stored in a cookie. So it remembers that you've signed in. So if I sign to a page once, if I leave and come back, it will remember that I'm signed in, and it does that for like 30 days by default. So the fact that I signed in as person A, even though my form doesn't seem to reflect that, my browser has a cookie that says, hey, person A is currently signed in. And so it tells me who my auth state is and where that stuff has changed. Okay. Cool. But to note, right, we can then again go to sign in with an email address. I can sign in as a different person, person B. When I sign in, it tells me my auth state changed again. And now my Firebase user is person B. I'm now signed in as a new user. So this will be able to keep track of who I am at different places. Okay. So this Firebase object keeps track is our user object, keeps track of all the details, all the things we need to know. Effectively, this is my current user object. By default, it has things like a display name. So it does keep track of like what name I typed in when I logged in. It has my email if I logged in with an email password. If I connected through Google or Facebook, it won't have an email address. It won't know your email that you're associated with your Facebook account. It just says Facebook's who provided it. Facebook says you're the right person, and that's all it knows. You can also track like a phone number if you've logged in with a phone number. There's a photo URL. That's where you can put in like a link to not an actual image, but a link to an image to be associated with your user. And that's it. Again, the user list is not a database. We can't store arbitrary data in there. Those are the only properties, the only fields that we're able to store in that get associated with a particular user account. Everything else we have to do manually. We have to sort of associate user IDs with like their favorite shoe size. Okay, but in any case, we've now got our Firebase user, which means we can go ahead and take our user and assign it to our current user variable. Right? We can go ahead and call set current user and say that we want this Firebase user object to be our current user. Yeah. We refresh our page. If we go to our chat page, notice it now says that I am now signed in. And it actually thinks I'm signed in with an avatar that doesn't exist, right? With some user image. If I try to post a message, it gets really mad because, again, there's no user ID. All these properties that we want to happen with our user don't exist. because our Firebase auth object here doesn't have those properties. So what can we do? Well, we can go through all of our code and modify it. So instead of looking for things like a user ID, we're instead looking for what Firebase calls it, and Firebase calls it just UID, a shorthand. We can make it so instead of showing the image URL, which is what we use to get this icon here, we're instead showing the photo URL, right? We can change that as well. That would involve changing all my code that already works. I don't want to do that. So what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to take this local Firebase user object. And again, this is a local object, right? This isn't actually modifying. It's not actually what's in the data. It's not changing what's in the database, right? What's on the website or what's on the Firebase's console, right? In that user list. This was it just saying, give me a copy. Like, let me see what user things you have. But I could take my Firebase user ID and I can give it a user ID, which is the form that I want, and say that that value is whatever the object's UID happens to have been. And with that, suddenly it thinks I'm actually signed in because now my user object has a user ID. If I then try to post a new message, we're still missing username. Let's go ahead and we'll fill in all the pieces. Firebase user objects can have it. We're give this local object a username key because that's what it's looking for, which happens to be the Firebase user object's display name. We can go ahead and give it, while we're at it, we'll give it a Firebase user objects image URL. I think that's how we call it. Let me double check my user list. All right, here's the structure we want for our users. Sorry, user image. There we go. Oh my gosh, we're in app. User image can be the Firebase user objects photo URL. So again, we're taking this object that had some fields and we're adding more properties to it. The way that JavaScript works is that our objects can have as many properties as we want. We just may not use them all. So what we're doing is we're adding in the properties that we want to use while kind of ignoring the fact that there are these extraneous properties that we don't want to use, we're not interested in. And even though those happen to have the same values, that's okay because we're just sort of doing a shortcut for being able to display stuff. All right, and with that, finally, notice it now says person B's avatar, right? My username link is in here, even though this image is broken because there isn't actually, because this is again a null value. We can then, of course, put a message. I am person B. Oh, console. I can post it. And okay. Or well, let's see, what's our do? So if that value is null, I don't want it to be null. So instead, I'm going to have it be this default value, or this null object. There we go. I haven't put the right like error catching things later in the code, so we have to put it earlier. Finally, can I go ahead and put this a message? I am person B. Will you finally work? Still no. Modify property, all messages. Oh my gosh, this is a database problem. All right, hold on a second. All right, fixing the issue is that I just had a typo here, right? We're assigning it to user image, not image. All right, and with that, finally, refresh our page. We're logged in as person B, right? Person B is who we're currently logged in as. That's who our auth state chain we are. I am person B. We can post that, and our message gets posted to our database, and everything works perfectly. We have a user account. Right, we have our little icons. Everything is in place because, again, we've specified that this user is going to be a user whose ID is going to be our Firebase ID, whose username is the Firebase display name, whose picture is Firebase's photo URL, or if that doesn't exist, is sort of by default null image. And then we just set that to our current user, and now we just have a current user, which fits into everything that has worked with our app so far. You can go to a profile page, and I can even see I made a little profile page. We can see what that user is. Everything works. Awesome. Cool. All right. If we want to log in as somebody else, so if I refresh my page and or if I just go to the sign in form, oh my God, not you. Go to localhost/sign in. There we go. Right. I can say I want to sign in with a different user. So I was currently signed in as I was previously signed in as person B. I can sign in as a@a.com. Whoop. I typed the password correctly. Right, sign in there. If we now go to chat, I'm now signed in as person A. We can't tell there's no picture here, but I am person A. Hi, B. I'm A. I can now post person A. So again, I can now switch users, signing in as a different user account, and that signs into my application. Importantly, we had built our application around just a generic user object value stored in state. And we said, given that we have this object that represents a user, here's how our application should work in terms of posting messages, in terms of like doing, who's allowed to see what pages, what's protected, and all that stuff. Like everything we had built before didn't actually relate to Firebase. It was just, I have a user object, I'm good to go. All we then did is we said, when the user signs in, make that user object, set that state variable based on the Firebase user that they've signed in as. So we are now sort of all set on that. Okay. Of course, we want to switch users. It would be nice if our sign out button works. So we can go ahead and add that in as well. So this sign out button is in our header bar. So we'll have to go to our header bar. If I want to sign out, there is a function I can use so I have my event handler that happens when I click the sign out button. If I want to sign out, there is a function I can use from Firebase's auth library. So we're going to start by importing. We're going to import stuff from Firebase's auth library. What we're going to need to import is, well, first we're going to need to import the getAuth function because I need to be able to access the authenticator. And then the function we're going to use to sign out is called sign out. Again, beautiful name, perfectly named. There's other functions that we can use to manage signing in, signing out, etc. If you want to do this, if you don't want to use styled Firebase UI, if you don't want to use Firebase UI at all, if you want to just use build your own forms. For example, there is a function, which is literally, I think, my favorite function name in the world, which is sign in with email and password that does exactly what it says. So again, this is where you can find things. We're doing sort of a bunch of different like account management stuff. All those functions are built into the Firebase auth library. But in any case, I'm interested in signing out. So I can write my sign out function. I'm going to go ahead and call sign out. First I'm going to need my authenticator, get auth. And then I'll call sign out, and I'm going to pass it in the auth function for who we're signing out with, like what user list we're using to sign out. And that can then be used to sign out my user. Now, importantly, when the user signs out, that creates an on-auth state change. And this is probably going to crash, but let's go ahead and we'll try it out. So I'm going to hit sign out. And then you'll notice what happens is that our auth state changed, and then our user became null. So if the user has logged out, Firebase, this user object, this thing passed in as an argument, will be null. So I can actually do that. I can say if Firebase user object is not null, right? If it's not null, if it has an actual value, if there's an object there, then we know if the user signed in. Otherwise, if it is null, the user signed out. And then, of course, we can then finish this up. So let's go ahead and we'll put a block in here. If the user signed in, we can do all, well, here, let's do this stuff. We're going to put our auth state change message that happens because our auth state changes no matter what. If the user has signed in, then we're going to go ahead and say that our current user is this new Firebase object that's all configured. Otherwise, if the user has signed out, then we can set our current user object to effectively be null. That's what we would set it to be, but we don't actually want it to be null. What I like to do is I'd like to use this null object, this null user value that we got from that we have in our users list, right? We'll just use this sort of this like log out person, log in person, signed out person. So because that's got all the properties that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and say that if I want to sign out, we're going to change to being our default users, person 0. And with that, when I'm signed out, it says that I'm now signed out. When we are signed out, it shouldn't, and we want to view we click, so we go to sign in, right? There's our sign in page. I can sign in with an email, a@a.com, password. And I'm now signing as person A. If I go to sign out, I'm now signed out again. What we can do is once the user has signed in, right? Once we've actually authenticated as user, we can make it so that our sign-in page, for example, we can add some routing work so that our sign-in page doesn't actually, like, if the user is logged in, don't actually show this route, go to somewhere else instead. There's some logic we can do to add that in. I'm going to leave it out for now, right? So instead of saying sign into view, for example, we can instead redirect to the sign-in page. That way, if they're signed out, right, if they try to go to chat, they always keep getting back to the sign-in page. And we can do something that says, like, when we finish signing in the user, we can try to redirect them to or when the user gets signed in, right, when this auth state is changed, we can redirect them where you need to go. It can get a little bit tricky, but I'm gonna deal with that. We'll let the route sort handle that. Cool. And that's the authenticator. That's what there is. That's how it works. So the things that we need to know, if I want to get user accounts up and running and working with my application, is I need to, after we've imported our styled Firebase auth, right? Once we've gotten our ability to sign the user in, I'm just going to add in an event handler that says that when the user has logged in or logged out, this is when I then want to be able to navigate them. I want to be, here's how I actually change what my current state is. And then based on that state, I choose what to render. Choose whether I want to show particular routes, choose if I want to show particular content, and everything works perfectly.